name is Emma Doring, and this is my Physics 2211 Lab 3. Here's an agenda of what I'm going to be going through. The purpose of Part 1 of this lab was to find the mass of a black hole using Newton's second law and parallel and perpendicular motion. The purpose of Part 2 was to simulate a figure-8 orbit of a spaceship around a planet and its moon and find the necessary initial velocity for this orbit using Newton's second law. The models and principles for Part 1 I used the velocity update formula, position update formula, momentum formula, Newton's second law, perpendicular and parallel net force, and universal gravitational force, and these were all used in sequence to eventually find the mass of the black hole. For Part 2, I used the universal gravitational force, the velocity, and position update formulas, and these were used to calculate the net forces on the moon and on the spaceship. The preview of my results for Part 1, I found the mass of the black hole to be 8.22 times 10 to the 33 kilograms, and there's the computational model of the orbit of the star around the black hole. And then for Part 2, the initial velocity that I came to was negative 23,000, 29,000 meters per second, and there is the orbit of the spaceship in magenta and the orbit of the moon in cyan. My initial conditions for Part 1, the gravitational constant, the mass of the star, and then the change in time and the initial time. And then for Part 2, it was the gravitational constant and the mass of the planet, the moon, and the ship, all separate masses, and then the change in time and the initial time. The experiment details for Part 1, the system was the star and the black hole, nothing in the surroundings. And my steps, I pasted the starter code into GlowScript, set my GT email address equal to the seed value, put in the initial conditions, and then edited all the formulas in the calculation loop to find the mass of the black hole, and then I had to average these masses in the end. For Part 2, the system was the spaceship, planet, and moon, nothing in the surroundings again, and then I pasted the starter code into GlowScript, chose an initial velocity of the ship, wrote equations for the net force on the moon and the ship, and then by each object, as well as equations for the distance between each object. I wrote the velocity and position update formulas for the moon and ship and tested different velocities until I found an orbit where the ship didn't crash. For the coding, so on the left is my coding for Part 1, which shows the calculations used to find the mass of the black hole, and then on the right is my coding for Part 2. It shows the calculations for the net force on the moon and the net force on the ship, as well as the position and velocity updates for both of them to keep them in motion. The final results for Part 1, again, there's my average mass, and then my computational model, and on the left is the Excel sheet that I used to average the mass. So basically, after I found all of the masses from GlowScript, I had to put them into this Excel sheet to average them, and then the average is what I found the final mass to be. And then for Part 2, again, there's my initial velocity of the spaceship and my computational model, and basically I tested multiple velocities of the spaceship before arriving at this one that produced this orbit. And even though it's not a figure 8, it orbits the moon and the planet without crashing into either one. Possible sources of error. For Part 1, there could have been a typo in my coding calculations, and then also the mass of the black hole is actually an average, so it may not be accurate fully. And then for Part 2, the initial velocity of the spaceship doesn't exactly produce a figure 8, but rather a different orbit. Additional questions. So what does it mean? The difference between the net force and the rate of change of momentum is just what they're affected by. Mathematically, they're equal quantities, and so are their parallel and perpendicular components, but net force is affected by all the forces acting on a system, whereas the rate of change of momentum is affected by the system's velocity and mass. And this is why the net force always points towards the black hole in this part of the lab, whereas the momentum changes direction based on the star's velocity. And then what if I wanted to predict the motion of the entire system For part 2, I would need to include the net force on each object in the system, not just on the moon and the spaceship, and this is because there's a gravitational force between each of the objects that contributes to the overall net force, and for dominant forces, the objects with the highest mass would produce dominant gravitational forces. And that's it. Thank you for watching.